right. Thanks very much for this. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. So just a bit of acknowledgement here. So this is, I'm going to report results on a project that we've completed with Daniel. Some of this work I'm going to talk to has been funded by the Commonwealth Department of Home Affairs and the AVERT network. So do I control, can I move to the next slide?
Just say next slide. Just tell me to say next slide.
Just say next slide when you're
next
ready.
slide.
Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah. Okay, yes. So disguised compliance is a problem. So we're talking here in reference to individuals in CVE case managed programs deceiving or manipulating staff about their degree of de-radicalisation and disengagement. Disguised compliance as an issue has come to the fore because of the increasing number of terrorist offenders and due for release and questions about their degree of disengagement. You had the case in the UK, Usman Khan, he went through the DDP, the Distance and Disengagement Program was released. He participated in a community reintegration program and he subsequently committed a terrorist act, London Bridge, Fishmonger Hall attack. He stabbed 2 academics at a reintegration conference. Also claims about skepticism around the level of proof that we have no evidence that de-radicalisation programs works. We have to be quite skeptical of the degree to which individuals have disengaged when they've been subject to interventions. One of the other issues around the presence of disguised compliance or the risk of disguised compliance, it represents challenges for assessing authenticity of client change. We prefer, Dan and I prefer the term levels of desistance. Desistance does capture more of client change within case management. I mean, the term desistance is borrowed from criminology. It captures client change or sees individual change more as a social process, and that desistance is a matter of degrees. It's not an end point. I think that's a much more useful term we find than using the terms disengagement and or de-radicalisation. So next slide, thanks. So the data sources and inspiration of this presentation is the DC Disguised Compliance Project itself. We did a literature review using systematic review methods across 321 sources from psych, policing, criminology, corrections, etc., social work. We looked at 3 case studies across the English and non-English speaking sources. Gleibenheimer Fallujah in Austria, Abdallah K in Germany, and Usman Khan in the United Kingdom. Each 3 of them had been subject to interventions. Each 3 of them had gone on to commit some sort of terrorist attack after, or some sort of criminal violent offence after being subject to an intervention and monitored by police, and often are seen as examples of disguised compliance. And also SME interviews, subject matter interviews with CVE practitioners from Australia, Germany, United Kingdom, and Indonesia. I'm also drawing on some work that Daniel and I are working on around what does disengagement look like, developing a theory of desistance that really is trying to engage this issue of sustainability of client change when it comes to disengagement or de-radicalisation. Also, I'm also influenced by the work I've done around CV evaluations. I've evaluated a number of case managed programs here in Australia, developing different metrics, which has, of course, seen my attention drawn to this issue of what does authenticity look like. So next slide, thanks. So disguised compliance, what are the lessons from the literature that we looked at? Well, it's clear that deception does not always equate to malicious intent. This is very important to understand. There can be a spectrum of deceptive behaviours, some which are quite, the motivation which are quite malign, and others that can be quite malicious, but we have to appreciate that's what occurs when we're dealing with issues of client engagements. Around the literature shows within, when we think about this disguised compliance, that of deception, we have to understand and give consideration to social desirability, People may act in a way to please their caseworker. They may no motivation to follow through on their intervention plan, or they may have very little capacity to do so, but they're willing to please the individual. So social desirability is also a factor that has to be taken account of. Disguised compliance is shaped by context. We'll talk about the community or correctional context. It's also shaped by individual motivations and capacities. The ability to deceive consistently is cognitively demanding. And this means that, some clients will be good at it, some clients will not. So we can't assume that deception is always going to be a default for individuals who are being managed in case managed interventions. Also, when it comes to practitioners themselves, they're not very good at picking up deception, and often they can misinterpret behaviours such as non-verbal cues that might be seen as deceptive, but actually might just be the behavioural, the ways in which certain clients are behaving who might be young, have mental health issues, or could have other psychosocial deficits. The key lesson from this literature reviewed is that, yes, behaviours indicative of disguised compliance does not mean that previous engagements were not inauthentic or that future engagements will necessarily be, because it's not always malicious. There can be social desirability. There can be difference in motives and intentions, and the issue of interpretation of that behaviour is important. So next slide. So the case studies. Well, in all three of the case studies, the Austrian, German, and UK case, there were clear flaws in case management. Yes, there was evidence of disguised compliance. When you look at the detail of each case, there were gaps in how the individual was managed. There were gaps and flaws in case management and risk assessment. There were often poor information sharing across agency. This was particularly the case with Usman Khan. There's a really interesting coronial inquest report on the way, which looks at how he was managed. Information cannot be actioned. So in the case of the Austrian individual, he tried to procure weapons in Slovenia. That information was passed on to authorities in Austria. They didn't act on it. There can be incongruences that are overlooked in statements, belief, and behaviours across contexts that can lead to very different risk assessments being undertaken, or can result in very different risk assessments. This is particularly the classic case in the Usman Khan case. He was assessed as high risk just prior to his release by a trained psychologist using the ERG. Following his release, he was then assessed as low risk by a probation officer using the ERG, simply because the difference in the discrepancy was simply related to the access to information around behaviours, because the risk assessments that were done in the community were not placing enough emphasis on how he had behaved just prior to his release, where he was actually still acting in quite radicalised ways in prison. But nonetheless, he was released. Also, other thing is there became too much reliance on indicators of compliance. So just simply turning up to a program was often taken as an indicator of progress, rather than actually looking at the testing of behavioural change. This is the case across all three individuals. In the case of Khan, he was participating in an educational program in the community. However, he was not engaging in any of the classes. He was not completing any of the work. He was not turning up to any of the classes. It was not actually, his participation was almost zero. And so there was not enough attention paid to that incongruence. I suppose one of the key lessons here is that, when these cases arise, you will get people saying, here are examples where radicalized individuals by default are deceptive. They cannot be trusted. And therefore, we need responses that are about monitoring, surveillance, and increased attention. That was particularly so with the Khan case. And I think I would say that's really unhelpful, because it actually obscures the debate around how these individuals can be effectively managed, and actually what is authentic in relation to disengagement or desistance. Next slide, thanks. So when it comes to the SME interviews, these are this doesn't do justice to the richness of the data we got out of these interviews. So just very short points I want to make here is consistently it was argued or stated and cases were provided, examples were provided where disguised compliance is highly contextual, very much reflected what was highlighted in the literature. But in particular, the way in which clients act can be influenced by the broader CV environment around legislative responses, for example, and ongoing detention that some clients may face, and that can influence their behaviours or how they engage and their levels of openness. The other point is that we have to be careful that we don't confuse disguised compliance with social desirability and desire to please. Some clients in case managed interventions, that can be the primary motivator. The other thing we have to understand is that failure does, just because an individual might fail, does not indicate a certain level of deception and how sincerely committed they were. They just may experience setbacks. This is what all CV practitioners have said, that things going wrong for an individual is a common occurrence. This was highlighted in my own research when I looked at the case managed programs. There are going to be setbacks. The issue of deception or incongruence or being more guarded, which might be interpreted as a form of deception, can actually be a part of working out the client case manager relationship. So levels of disguised compliance may occur earlier on in the process of engagement as the relationship is developing, as the client is testing out the caseworker to see if they're actually sincere in helping them or finding out how much they actually know. But the important thing is that you want to be looking at how that is changing over time to its actual authenticity of that behaviour. Next slide, please. Disguised compliance, it was not judged as highly prevalent, not just as prolific. One comment I remember, many examples are oft, however, people were not naive to the possibility of it occurring. Many of the examples were often described as quite clumsy. The debate around disguised compliance, though, and the issue of clients being deceptive was seen as sometimes being unhelpful, in that caseworkers can constantly question their decisions. So some of the key flags that practitioners reported they looked at to sort of warn them about the possibility of levels of deception is, for example, an abrupt professed change in support for extremist beliefs. This is the epiphany moment. I'm different, and I don't believe that. It's abrupt, where we know disengagement is about change over time. It's long-term. Same, abrupt shift in enthusiasm and support. They can be highly disengaged, and all of a sudden, the next week they're highly engaged. That may lead to a certain level of skepticism needed to be actioned. Incongruence between statements and behaviours across contexts. So what they're saying in sort of the client caseworker context is very different to what they're doing perhaps in another service provider context. They may be saying, I'm doing really well on the psych appointments, but they're simply turning up the psych appointments and spending the whole time on their phone. So that can be the sorts of incongruences that might indicate something's not right here in the sincerity of engagement. Also, efforts to deflect, minimise and deny responsibility can raise questions about the sincerity. Deflect, discussions around sensitive topic. Minimise, for example, the seriousness of the actions or behaviours they were undertaken in being engaged in extremist acts. Or minimise can also be about the issue of happenstance, that they say, well, I just happened to be in that place where I met this individual. That is a person of interest that I'm told not to associate with, etc. That they may be in the community being monitored or assisted, and they sort of minimise the series of contact with known past individuals who have been involved in extremist acts or a part of their network. They say it's just happenstance, it just happened by accident, for example. That's sort of seen as minimising the seriousness of what that contact might be. And also denying responsibility, saying that they were pressured, they did it for religious obligations, they were peer pressured. Well, that might be important. There is an issue of looking at their own individual decision making as well, and that can sort of, this was seen as raising potential flags of insincerity. Next slide, please. Strategies for authenticity testing itself. Well, from this research, is from the different data sources and also previous work, it's about drawing on a variety of information across sources, the idea of the common thing of triangulating, assessing statements and responses and behaviours across different contexts. You know, individuals in these case managed programs will be engaging different service providers, different agencies. You need to look at the consistency in how they're engaging across those various contexts and agencies. You need to give individual weight to costs and consequences. I'll say more about this, but high effort. Actions that require high effort and high cost can show authenticity and sincerity. Using different questions and forms of engagement when engaging clients, getting at issues in different ways, for example, and providing opportunities for clients to signal desire to change. So it's also about stepping back and letting clients being proactive as well, and also then observing how they action or do that. The important point, though, is that, you know, this was clearly emphasised, is that really rapport building, transparency in the case manager relationship, trust building is essential to the caseworker client relationship. It's essential to detecting disguised compliance. Yes, rapport building, trust building in particular can create opportunities for exploitation for caseworkers to be exploited, for them to have their own social desirability as well towards the client. But nonetheless, I mean, it's still, while that exists, it's still essentially important to really being able to effectively manage and detect disguised compliance itself. Next slide. So in conclusion, what these results, what can we take away from these results on this disguised compliance project when it comes to thinking about authenticity of change? Because that's what we're trying to promote here. And I've got a few ideas. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just simply some ideas I've been toying with and Gail and myself are working on, etc. What does authenticity constitute? And as I'm just saying, these are some thoughts. It's not a comprehensive list. They're all not perfect. I think authenticity of disengagement, desistance, whatever term you want to talk about, but thinking about client change, high cost actions that take effort, they would be authenticity. It's about shedding extremist identity and associated networks. It's about distancing from associates, distancing from prior radicalized networks. It's about denunciation of prior beliefs or actions, particularly public denunciation. That would be, you would think that would be a reflection of some levels of authenticity. What does that mean for case management? And that's what the italics is about in each point. Well, for case management, it means that there needs to be support for the consequences of those behaviours. One is social isolation. The second one is the potential for violent repercussions from the group or prior peers or associates. It's one we need to be skeptical of cheap signals. That is, they're just talking. They're denouncing, but they're not doing anything. That's cheap signals. The other authenticity is also about expressions of resilience. Now, I'm really reluctant to use this term resilience. I know it's loaded. There's different interpretations, there's different scales, etc. But I'm thinking about it in a very particular way about the individual ability to cope, to deal with stressful events, to deal with adversity, to have adaptive responses where things go wrong. Because there will, as I go back to my prior point, there will be disappointments for these clients. It's also about having introspection, about about your actions, about your decisions. That's also a characteristic of resilience, of introspection. It's really important here. What does that mean for case management? It means when dealing with clients, you've got to psychologically ready them prior to potentially any individual ideological discussion around creating these sort of characteristics of resilience, for them to be able to process the ideological discussion, which can be quite taxing. It's also about generating capacity to deal with setbacks, because things will go wrong. Another feature
You're
of
actually,
authenticity.
sorry, Adrian, you're at time.
Sorry?
You're at time.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll just got one more slide. So crowding out the use of motivation for violence. Just the next slide. Compliance. I say compliance is still relevant for some clients because about the need to follow routines. You want to look at incongruences and the efforts at redemption as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Adrian and Daniel, for a fascinating and insightful presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce to you now Annemarie van der Weert from the Utrecht University for Applied Science. Annemarie will speak with us about justice and risk assessment, the subjectivity of screening for early radicalisation processes. Thank you, Annemarie.
Yes, thank you. 3 practical comments. If you think what's wrong with your hand, I've attended a Hindu wedding on my stopover in Kuala Lumpur, so that's that. The other thing is I'm not feeling too well, so if I sound a bit cloudy, that's because I'm a bit under the weather. 3rd practical comments. Thanks, John Horgan, for quoting me in your keynote speak. I feel very honored. Immediately posted it on LinkedIn to get my moment of fame here. My research data is like not really new, but it is more about reflection, and it is, I think, interesting, especially in the light of the keynote of Dr. Horgan about the subjectivity of early detection. Now, in the Netherlands, you must know everything is decentralized. So a lot of tasks for in the early stages to detect if somebody is even in a radicalization process are decentralized to the local level. So you must bear that in mind when you listen to my talk. And this early assessment is done by, as we call that, first line professionals. So this is one thing that is very important, otherwise you won't understand my talk. Is this for the next slide? Or can I just, that one, that works. Okay. The outcome of this is also, by the way, published in the Journal of Policing Intelligence and Counterterrorism. So if you want to look it up, that's very recent. It's also been published in John Horgan's special issue on political violence. So that's just as practical if you want to read more about it. So I work for the Lectorate Access to Justice. Well, what does that mean? Okay, judgment is spelled wrong here. We look at judgments and risk assessments in a democracy. Well, that sounds really obvious, but bear in mind that that means that we have a principle of justice. And we have a principle of equality to bear in mind. Why is that so important? We can't just judge, simple as that. We can't just assess, especially not in an early stage. We can't just say, oh, you are going to be the potential next danger. We can't do that, not in any criminal account. I mean, I can't just point out here in the room who could potentially be a rapist or a child abuser or a domestic violence, whatever, offenser. The same accounts for well, terrorism, and let alone for being radical or extreme. So with these principles in mind, when we look at the early detection process, which is done in the very, very early stages, then there's of course some dynamics going on. So if you're working for a municipality, for instance, and you look at people's behavior or ideas or mindsets, then you also have to do with constantly changing conditions. That means that there's influences of the environment, but also like even globally developments. And you have to do a real-time response to that. There's poorly defined tasks. I'm not going into that, but we all know the problem with the terminology of radicalization, extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism. You have to work under time pressure because you're afraid that if you're not intervening early enough, then you might be too late. It also has for you as a professional some significant personal impact. And you have to work with other decision makers who are, some of them are experienced, some of them are not. And this can cause for the certain groupthink bias, for example, or other human thinking biases. So that is the situation that we have to work under. Now, there's a very interesting article written by a Dutch colleague of mine, actually, they're both called De Graaf. It's already from 2010. And they say, like, okay, we can make all these policy documents. The thing is, it's done by people. So whatever is written in the policies, in the end, it's real people having to do the assessments. That is called normative professionalism. You can't really do that methodical at this stage, not in the early detection stage, because we're not talking about actions here. We're talking about mindsets or worldviews or people's beliefs, ideas. So they say then the performative power of these policy documents actually lies within the skills and the attitude of professionals to be able to identify potential risks in individuals. Okay, so I thought that is very, very interesting because that would mean we need a bottom-up approach to see how this is done. I'm doing practical research, so we have a general question, how do they actually do this? Because we don't know. The Dutch National Coordinator of Terrorism, they gave, like I said, it's decentralized, they gave municipalities a task, go and be on the lookout for who's might be in radicalization processes. So I was like, okay, so how do these professionals deal with this task? Well, that led to our research project, bottom up, like I said. So we started with youth workers. We asked them simple questions. So you have to be on the lookout. We'll take the group youngsters up till 25, adolescents. What are you looking for? We also asked municipal officials, like, how do you weigh like signals that are reported to you in the municipality? And we also asked community police officers, so how do you actually acquire information in this state? You have no clear indicators of actions. It's all about ideas, mindset, and worldviews. What do you do? That was simply the open question. So it basically came down to, we actually asked more, but I'm making this more compact for this presentation. So how do frontline workers assess whether someone poses a potential risk? The most important thing here again is, I know I'm repeating myself, but I'm doing that on purpose, is that they're not looking at actions. They have to look for ideas, behaviors, and statements that could harm, meaning that could harm the values of freedom in general and also the respect of human rights of others. These again are democratic values. These are again the principles that we're leaving from. So then the model I used to look at their judgments is basically moral judgment, because I was not doing an evaluation if they were doing it good or wrong or bad or right. I was looking at their judgment of what they thought was good or bad or wrong or right, or if the views of people they were assessing, how would they judge them? So if you do moral judgments, you basically have three, this is the methodology. You can look at knowledge of the professionals. You can look at the framework that they live from. This is the normative framework. It's about norms and values. And you can look at the intuition, like their personal feelings, like how would they judge? So the questions I asked them in the interviews were based on these three indicators. I was, of course, mostly interested in the norms and values that they would bring into their judgment, because, again, it's normative professionalism. It's not methodological, not in this stage. So I was looking for the norms and values. So how do they assess? But actually, the outcome of all the interviews I've done was that they, in the end, said, I just go by gut feeling. If I have the feeling or the sense that something is not right, that's what I go for. That is my indicator. Well, I don't have to explain to you that this has a high potential for estimation errors. It can go anywhere. Like you can get over signaling or under signaling. And if we look again from the principles of equality and justice, then this is not, yeah, but you can't really say that that is the most legitimate way to do it as from a government leaving point. Because then basically it would mean that early detection on a local level would depend on the best person doing the job instead of best practice. Okay, so the outcome of our research is, of course, not rocket science. It does prove that it is a subjective matter, and that the professionals, at least the ones that I've interviewed, were not aware that they had to screen for intention, willingness, or incitement to infringe the values of freedom and showing disrespect, for example, human rights of others. This can be both violent and non-violent expressions of the people they were assessing. So we said, like, okay, we went back to the coordinator of counterterrorism and says, well, you can't just give the assignment to local people like this. It's too subjective. At least there has to be kind of a legal norm for them to intervene on democratic means or methods. And that again could be, you know, is that even yeah, big enough? Yeah. The review of systematic hate speech, for example, the spreading of fear, the spreading of disinformation, the demonizing of other groups or intimidation, or the violent methods that extremists could use, like the real violence and abuse, and, well, of course, attacks. That's the action. So I'm going to leave you with this, because this is the research presentation that's only about reflection. So I'm not giving you the answers on how to do it, because that's in other presentations, and I'm sure you've had already very good advice. If you want to hear more, see more about it on my website, we also made an animation to explain this a little more. If you want to do some more reflection, you can scan the QR code and fill in a form to maybe test your own judgment. What I do want to tell you is that based on our research, the national coordinator now decided, okay, we actually have to evaluate not how the early detection is done by professionals, but we actually have to make sure that we can test if it's done in a proper way or not. So there's now research done based on our projects, which I'm really, really happy about. And I'm involved in that research. So maybe in a couple of years time, we can give the outcome of that. So the research to raise awareness about how everything is done has in the end had some results, and I'm really happy about that. I do want to, based on the keynote from Dr. Horgan, you mentioned very clearly that you want to link with psychology when we do assessments and everything. what I missed a little bit in your presentation is the feeling of injustice as a motivator, because no matter what kind of ideology a person has, the feeling of injustice, or it's not right, it's not fair, and I have to do something, for professionals, that could be a very clear indicator that, at least at the psychological department, something is going on. And that doesn't mean that everybody who feels injustice or feels being treated not fair or things are not right becomes a terrorist, because I think we all experience these feelings on a daily basis. But this is a very important indicator, I guess, for professionals to bear in mind, because that has implications for interventions based on a psychological, from a psychological background. And please reflect on that if you want to say more about that. I'm not a psychologist, but a criminologist. So this was my presentation. And if you want to reach out, here's the email address and also the website link where you can watch the animation where we explain a little bit more about the research. Okay, it was my pleasure.
Very much, Annemarie, for a fascinating and wonderful presentation. I would like to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Annemarie. This question is for you. So look, I'm familiar with the work that you're doing, and I think it's really, really interesting and important. But I guess my question is about some of the fundamental assumptions that are built into this, because I think that some of the questions that you're exploring really go to the issue of, are we addressing extremism or violent extremism, what those thresholds mean, the paradox of the fact that in a free society, people are free to espouse ideas about unfreedom, if you like. I mean, you know, these are quite complex issues. So my question for you is, what is the view within amongst professionals in the Netherlands about how we draw the threshold or the boundary line between what people are free to think, as long as they're not acting on it or acting it out, you know, and when does early detection actually become problematic as an intervention in its own right? In other words, in the service of addressing one kind of harm or the potential for one kind of harm, when does that sort of early detection itself potentially become a social harm?
Yeah. That is a very good question, because this actually came up in the second meeting we had about the research that's being done now to evaluate the whole early detection system. And the researchers who are doing it, they didn't conceptualize what actually was the goal for early detection. So that was my comment back to them as well. They says, yeah, we're going to do this method. We're going to do research the outcomes of judgments and this and that. And says, well, you can't do that if you have not decided upfront what is actually the goal of early detection. How far do we want to do? You want to make people less extreme? No, that's not what we want to do. We don't want to decide how extreme their ideas even are. We wanna know if they could actually be harmful to others with their ideas and how far they are willing to go with that. That's what we want to assess. So we first have to conceptualize what exactly is the goal of early detection if we want to measure if it's done properly or to what extreme, what is the quality of it. Now, this has never been done before. There is no conceptualization of what the goal is of early detection in this phase. So that's why the research that's been done now in the Netherlands, I think, is really exciting. And again, I'm really happy that they do it, because then it comes back to, again, legal principles. So laws are made out of principles. You have, for example, the harm principle, you have the protection principle, you have the care principle, and early detection is based on literally all three of them. We want to protect the society from further harm. We also want to protect the individual for straying off, especially youngsters. We want to keep them in society. So that is care principle at the same time. So it's protection and care at the same time. There's also the safety principle at the same time. So it's actually a triangle and they overlap. And that makes it so extremely complicated. Now, I heard somebody say this morning, yeah, the law looks at actions, which are, of course, prohibited because we decided so. Well, in early detection, the question is, again, what do we want to achieve? Do we want to protect the person from straying off? Do we want to protect the society? Do we want to make sure that their views are less extreme? Or do we want to stop? Do we want to prevent that they're doing harm to other people? Well, I guess the last one should be most obvious, but yeah, that's why conceptualizing early detection is actually now very, very important to do. Sorry for the long answer.
Anna, thank you very much for your research. And I know early detection in CV is one of the most difficult things for researcher because we are dealing with the ideas and behaviors. My question is, what's the subjectivity of your participants? When you ask them, how can they detect that this person is extreme or not, depending on, as you said, ideas, behaviors, and these things. And we know from Prevent in UK that it's problematic, as Michelle said, that they found that, for example, I remember the statistic that 80% of the people referred by the first responder was not true, and most of them from Muslim community. So the same question is how they identified ideological-based extremists or religious-based extremists. And also, again, how you determine subjectivity of your participants.
Yeah, well, the first thing would be I refer back to what Dr. Horgan said, let go of the idea that it's about ideology, because it's more about sentiments and feelings of injustice. Something is not right, not fair, that leads a person into an act of violence. They want to change that, and that could be political, religious, or whatever ideology. That doesn't really matter. The other thing is, when I started this research project in 2015, the systems weren't set up that well. And what you're referring to, the situation in the UK, also stems back from that time. And I think we've already learned quite a lot since then. So in relation to multidisciplinary judgment teams or assessment teams, I think nowadays, at least I hope, and in the Netherlands, in a lot of municipalities, they've now also invited the social workers to the table when they have to assess cases. Well, in the beginning, it was only municipality and the police doing it. And when you only let police do the judgment, well, you know, they're about law enforcement, and they're looking for, in the end, how do you call it in the Dutch? Well, in the end, it's about prosecuting, and it's not so much about keeping people included in society who are straying off. So it's very important, if you do risk assessments at this stage, in the early detection stage, to include social workers. They have a different perspective, a different view, and they know other things about the person you're talking about. So their perspective and views are very important, because it balances them out. The on the lookout for, okay, yeah, we're going to prosecute.
Any further questions for our speakers? I have a question for Adrian, and that is regarding, in terms of understanding compliance and I guess authenticity, which is something you brought up in your presentation. what the role of tolerance for, say, complexity and ambiguity might be in this process, because the literature on radicalisation often reveals that people who join violent extremist groups tend to think along black and white lines of friend and enemy dichotomies, in groups and out groups. I'm wondering what kind of appreciation for ambiguity and complexity and movement away from this kind of thinking is something that might play into the way you assess disengagement.
Yeah, I think that's part of this issue of dealing with ambiguity is part of the is a feature of this idea of resilience. Definitely, it fits in that with interest, and also this idea of introspection. that concept has come out of the psychology and criminology literature itself. So yes, I think it's part of that, and it's part of preparing individuals for those more intense discussions, sort of laying the groundwork, particularly around, I know people are saying ideology has no role, but anyway, I'm going to say it around the influence of ideological beliefs, which is, as Daniel would say, ideology is problem, the way in which you frame a problem. It's a solution and provides a justification. There's different ways we can think about ideology. The thing I would say about, you mentioned about compliance, I think, I know I ran out of time, but I think compliance is still important for some clients, particularly those clients who have difficulties in day-to-day coping and following a routine. So for some clients, compliance can be an indicator of authenticity, given their capacity to participate in a case managed program, which by default assumes one can commit to a routine. But some clients, because of their psychosocial capacities, may have trouble in doing so. So I don't think we should just throw out compliance, even though what the case study said about in this research, I don't think we shouldn't throw out compliance as an indicator of authentic client change. If that's all you're seeing, well, then yeah, questions might be asked.
Thanks, Adrian.
Well,
That brings us to a close of this session.
yeah, thank you so much. Vivian, thank you very much for this session. Let's give them all a round of applause. I think we